Colleagues, good afternoon to you, and a very warm welcome to what is our first in a whole series of what we call Clumsy Webinars under the auspices, obviously, of SIOPSA. And we will be dealing with specifically topics. So in this first one, I just want to give a little bit of an overview of what are we trying to do with the webinars. You will recall that from the BIOP Caucus establishment, some of the things that we were doing in those conversations were trying to understand what were some of the critical issues emerging in that context within the broader kind of transformation agenda of SIOPSA, but specifically here for Black IOPs. And we were trying to understand what are the issues. We deliberated with people. We started talking about what are some of the critical issues emerging out of that, and then having to work out how are we going to deal with those particular issues. And that's what we were doing in subsequent meetings coming out of the BIOP caucus. And so one of those things, there are quite a number of things we were looking at, not only issues around what we kind of circumscribed as a major theme was systemic racism. We also look at social issues within the context of the experiences of BIOPs. And then thirdly, we also look at it from an individual perspective. And you will see over time, we will be tackling some of these topics as we go along. So that is basically a little bit of a context to how these clumsy webinars, which is one of those key actions emerging out of the work we're wanting to do for BIOP Caucus. This is just the first one, and as I say, there will be a few more over the coming months into next year. And I think our intent is very much to keep the conversation going with regard to these critical issues that we are trying to deal with. I'll give a bit of a feel of how are we intending to run these webinars, an hour each. We're not intending to stretch it beyond, an hour, because it's little bits of conversation going on all the time. And that's really what we're trying to achieve, is to keep the conversation around the transformation within SIOPSA going. And that's what these clumsy webinars are about. So let me tell you a little bit about what these clumsy webinars would look like. My apologies. We see them very much as clumsy conversations. And if you think about the word clumsy, a little bit like you're not so sure about, we're not trying to do here a research project around a particular topic. We're wanting to take some information out of what we have researched, our experiences and so on, bring it into these conversations, hear what others have to say. Let's converse about the issues. That's the intent of it, on critical transformation issues within SIOPSA. By adopting a conversational style of discovery rather than a research style of final conclusions. So it's almost like opening it up rather than closing it in this particular instance. A second very critical characteristics of our clumsy seminars are going to be that it must be a psychological space where a person feels free enough to be able to put a viewpoint on the table and to hear feedback about it. Now, good conversation is about advocating your position, obviously, but also inviting inquiry from others into the validity and logic of what you're talking about. And that's a kind of conversation that we're trying to have within this space. So the format for our webinar is going to be, I'll spend just about 15 minutes just introducing the topic. And that's what every discussant will do over the next couple of months. Then we'll launch into a plenary conversation. They're not even specific questions about how should we go about it or a structure. It's simply launching into conversation. Everybody can participate in that conversation. And then we'll summarize towards the end what are some of the key learnings emerging from this conversation, these clumsy conversations that we are hoping to have. So colleagues, that is just an introduction. Again, welcome to you. And we will, over the next couple of months, be introducing you to a number of these very interesting topics. Please come and participate, be part of the conversation as we are launching into this. Okay, so I'm going to also just ask Marissa if she's still here, and or Kirsty, just to notice any kind of questions or comments emerging within the chat box, and that will form part of our conversation as we move along. Let me launch into it because of our time constraints with regard to it. First thing I'd like to share with you is to say that we need to think very carefully about what assumptions am I making that I'm not aware I'm making that gives me what I see. And this is a brilliant quote that comes from Rosamund and Benjamin Zander. Benjamin Zander, as some of you might know, is the a conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, and he couples a lot of his work, his music work, with leadership development. And that's a very interesting kind of combination. I've always been fascinated by some of the work he's doing. And he's asking this big question: what assumptions am I making that I'm not aware I'm making that gives me what I see? And what this fundamentally means is simply to say that, you know, there's a lot of things happening in our heads, assumptions about things happening around us. And if we don't check those assumptions we make, what happens is that they're already providing us with the outcomes of what we were looking for in the first instance. And that's what they mean by it gives us what we see. So the question has to be, are we aware that those assumptions have already drawn conclusions when we have not even been able to fully find the evidence to support what we are talking about? And basically that's what that is what we want to talk about, and what lies behind these assumptions that we are making. Therefore, I want to adopt an approach by what Chris Argyris is talking about. He says, talk is a window on the logic of your reasoning. And the very fact that we're sitting here together today and having a conversation around these issues is giving an indication to say, we want to talk so that we can check what is the logic of how we reason about the things that we say, especially in this context of our theme for today, mental models and unconscious bias. So those are just kind of two introductory remarks with regard to what I would like to talk about. Topic is fundamentally mental models. I'm not really going to touch on unconscious bias, because what you will see in the picture is that unconscious bias very much is underpinned by these mental models that I'd like to talk to you about. So let's launch into this conversation today. Firstly, I just want to share with you that from an action science, which is very much the field which I have developed myself in, and very much my doctoral studies were in this specific space of action science. Action science is also understood to be theories of action. In other words, what they mean by it is to say, what are the kind of theories that underpins the action that we embark on as individuals? And in this particular case of theories of action, I want to speak of it as design causality. What do I mean by it? It simply means we design the actions that we take in life. The actions of human beings do not happen by chance. They are deliberately planned according to rules that we cannot state. In other words, we design our own actions, first of all, inside our heads. There's a picture that we have. We have a theory about how are we going to embark on doing something. And then secondly, we embark on actions which we have designed in our heads to achieve consequences we intended. In other words, I have a picture in my head that I want to build, for example, a high-performing team. And so in my head, I've got this picture about what a high-performing team looks like. And I begin to design what kind of actions I must take. So for example, I need to coach my people, develop them, give them formal and informal feedback, etc. All of those actions, they already worked out in my head. How do I want to do it? Then I embark on those actions, and those actions then lead to consequences. Insofar as somebody would be able to say, well, they have achieved their intended consequences of building a high-performing team, because the feedback that others might give in this regard is to say it is a high-performing team. So if you were to look at this, it is the intentions that we have here, our governing values, that leads to certain actions. And those actions lead to consequences. And in the process, all of this feeds back. The consequences could feed back into the actions, or the actions could feed back into the values, or the beliefs, or the mental models that we have. The intent is that you change your behavior based on what the outcomes are, so that you are able then to say, no, I need to embark on a different process with regard to it. So that is what design causality is about. We design our own actions, and we design them in such a way that we want to achieve intended consequences. Now, these theories of actions, the theories that lie behind our action, which are these tacit rules that sit in our head that we cannot fully state for ourselves, because, but at the same time, they provide us with some kind of shorthand of how to look at the world, are of two kinds. The first one is espouse theory. And by espouse theory, we mean the values, beliefs, the action strategies, the kind of things that we believe in, claim to follow, and publicly communicate. So for example, I could say, I am an inspirational leader. And by that, I simply mean that I believe that I subscribe to certain values that speaks to me being an inspirational leader, and I take certain actions. The problem with espouse theory is often when you ask a person, can you illustrate what you mean by an inspirational, by inspirational leadership? It's quite likely the person would find it very difficult to explain it. It's in exactly the same way as our value systems that we have often in organization are very much espoused, but it is not what we necessarily live. And it is what we state, but when you look at it and you say, well, integrity is a main one of our main values here in our organization, but in practice, you don't see that quite manifesting in how people behave and so forth. The second kind of theory of action we can have. So the spouse theory is what we state publicly, what we believe in, okay? The second one is what we call theory in use, or a simpler word for it is mental models, which are designs that we have stored in our heads, according to which we design actions to achieve our intended consequences. What I've just told you about, it's designs that we have already stored. And by the way, these designs have been built up over a period of time through socialization and conditioning. There are two kinds. I just want to speak to the one which is what we call theories in use, the mental model. Simply to explain, sorry, let me just change that. Let me explain to you what theories in use are. They are simplified, the mental models. They are simplified pictures of the world that have some characteristics of the real world, but not all of them. They are a set of interrelated guesses about the world. And so we build up a picture. How do you relate, interact, and make sense of the world around you? That is what a mental model is. They could also be described as deeply held images of how the world works, images that limit us to familiar ways of thinking and acting, trapping us in defensive routines that insulate our mental models from examination. In other words, what happens is that we are, because it's in a defensive space, and defensive means you are trying to protect something, you are trying to hold on to something, and especially under circumstances where there are potential challenges from outside about what you believe already from childhood. And one could go into depth about it. The point simply is these mental models develop through conditioning and socialization from childhood, how we see the world, interact, make sense of it, and so forth. So, and it begins to shape what we see and how we act in that, because our acting follows on what we have already worked out in our heads, and therefore we see something and we act towards that particular thing. So I just want to propose to you that, again, it's not supposed to be an in-depth masterclass about mental models. I just want to propose to you that we should then begin to think about learning that goes beyond our behavior, because the way we act has already been designed in our head, which means we must tackle the design in order to change how we're going to act next. And so that kind of learning is basically described by this kind of model. It is around looking what are our intentions, how does it lead to actions or our behavior, and then the consequences of that behavior. Now, under ideal circumstances, if there's a match between all of these, it's great. Often we have a mismatch, because the mismatch is often between what we see are the outcomes and what we see in our actions. So what can we do? We can go and change our behavior. This is what we call single loop learning. And single loop learning simply means we are changing simply the behavior that sits, that leads to the unintended consequences that we see. We are saying that changing just behavior is not sustainable, because there are beliefs that drives this behavior. And that is what sits here in the governing values. Therefore, if one were to think about effectiveness, it must be about the degree to which I achieve my intended consequences, the degree to which what I see here as outcomes confirm what I intended in the first instance, because of the type of behavior I've taken will lead to a match. But as I say, there's error because there's a mismatch between intention and action. And what we're trying to do is to say, we need to get into a space of double loop learning in order to change this kind of thing more sustainably. I want to assert to you that there are possibly two mental models, and this is where I'll conclude, two mental models that underpin the issues in the context of systemic racism. Two that kind of hang together. The first one is white supremacy and then white privilege. And on the other hand, there's a mental model called Black internalized oppression and racism. Now, you won't find in a book that they say Black internalized oppression or racism is a mental model. I'm extrapolating and inferring from the idea of this mental model beginning to frame how we see the world and therefore how we're going to act on that world and then achieving whatever consequences we are looking for. That's what we mean by a mental model. I'm proposing to you that these are two potential or three potential mental models that sits in this context that makes the whole EDI implementation in organizations not successful. EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the results of it is that we're still wondering why is that happening. I'm proposing to you that there are potentially mental models underpinning why it is we are not able to achieve and deal effectively with these issues of unconscious bias. So we talk about it, but we don't sufficiently kind of dig into it and say, this is a very sensitive area to talk about, but we have to do that if we are hoping to achieve much more success with it. So white supremacy is the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other races, especially Blacks. White privilege can be defined as the unearned advantages and benefits that accrue to white people by virtue of a system of racial inequality and injustice. On the other hand, you have Black internalized oppression or racism. By this we mean the inculcation by Black people of white people's racist stereotypes, the values, the images, the ideologies, leading to feelings of disgust, self-doubt, self-hatred, and disrespect of Black people. So you're beginning to hate your own kind of people that you are coming from, and there are ways and we can express, give some examples of how that find expression. You know, the problem in the past, for example, of Blacks aspiring to have lighter skin is very much an indication of a symptom of Black internalized oppression. White privilege, we have spoken quite a lot about that in kind of the broad context, but an example that was given to me by some students that I work with at one of the universities was that when she and a Black classmate went to Pick n Pay, they were stopped. The sensor at the entrance of the shop went off as they went out, which meant they had to come, the security guard, Black security guard, called them back. But the Black security guard called only the Black person back, not the white person. That is what privilege is about. And then secondly, it was also demonstrated demonstrating this internalized oppression by the Black security guard dealing with a Black person and not with a white person, on the assumption that the white person is probably not at fault in this particular regard. So as just a very brief example of what we're talking about, I'm saying maybe we should begin to deal with these topics a little bit more in a space where it is going to be a sensitive conversation. And certainly in the broader SIOPSA, we're beginning to tackle that kind of conversation much more as we move along. I'm going to stop there and say, colleagues, that is just by way of introduction, some concepts that I believe are critical for us to begin to tackle the broader issue of a successful kind of diversity in organization. And the floor is open for conversation, questions, or comments from anybody. As I say, it's a conversational style we're adopting of discovery rather than finality. Thank you very much, everybody, for that opportunity. Any comments from the floor? I'm going to stop the presentation so that I can open up the broader screen and see who is where. And maybe a suggestion is when you do speak, open up your video in terms of either raising a question or making a comment with regard to it. Anybody? Let's hear. Any comments? Tandy, go for it. Your microphone is on, it's not on.
Phew, good evening, colleagues.
Hello, hello, Tandy.
Quite a sensitive one, hey?
Indeed.
A sensitive one because we are dealing with, like you indicated, what we at times may be conscious of, and it's explicit, it's there, but what may also not, we may not be conscious of to some extent, either by ourselves, but then the smell of it is there. It shows it's there. I'm just hoping that from what you've shared with us, Prof, that as we go on, we try and really dig into what I would call first the self. In my case here, I'm sitting, Prof, I'm looking at the two mental models that you mentioned, the Black oppression, and I'm like trying to dig into myself to say, are you even aware of it? Exactly. Are you even aware, Tandy, when you are showing it somehow, unintentionally so, but it's showing in your behavior? And I think for me, this is just, I would say, my point of departure to say, Tandy, before you talk about white supremacy, white privilege, what about the mental model, the second one, your Black internalized oppression? Because that's where you start with the self.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I just want to comment on something. Don't go away. The mental models are in themselves so insidious because they operate at an unconscious level. It's precisely what is the problem about it, because they operate in such a way that you're not even aware it's influencing how do you think and act in circumstances, you know? So for example, I'll give you one example of it. Have you ever come across us as Black people putting a little bit more harder pressure on, say, selecting the Black lecturer than selecting the white lecturer?
Yeah.
Why? Because we assume, and I'm not generalizing, so please don't take it as a generalization. I'm simply making that as a particular example, whereby we ourselves question the capability of the Black candidate more than what we would do so in the case of a white person. That is a very good symptom of internalized oppression.
I know, Prof. And like I'm saying, for instance, personally, I know generally with doctors, you find that we will go out of our way to look for a white doctor when there's a black doctor available.
Exactly.
To treat
Very
you.
good example. Do you know how we will shake in the plane if we hear there's only black pilots, piloting that plane?
Precisely.
You might feel very uncomfortable.
Precisely. I know I'm guilty of sometimes when I have to fix my car. I would rather, I find myself more relaxed when it's a white mechanic than when it's a black mechanic. Ask me, and like I'm saying, Prof, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, wow, yeah. Start with yourself, girl.
Sure.
Mm. Mm.
No, very important point. And please, colleagues, this is a conversation. It's not like a question and answer. I really invite you, join into the conversation, join in and give us your view. Give us, we're trying to just discover together rather than to say, this is the final picture, what it should look like. I just want to make one point in relation to what Thandi has just said is, in terms of, looking at ourselves, yes, we must look at ourselves as Black people very clearly with regard to this oppression and racism. One thing I would suggest we should not forget, though, in the process is that Black internalized racism is an outflow of white supremacy. In other words, if we were just left by our own, we will not have had this kind of thing in our heads. Now, it obviously compounds and reinforces itself over time, but Black internalized racism is not because we have an inherent incapability, an inherent lower IQ, an inherent whatever people believe is inherent. It simply has to do with the fact that because of the system that has pushed it down people begin to doubt themselves with regard to what should be their own particular talents, so just to make that point. But it's not to say that we should not take responsibility for our own, because that's the consciousness that we as Black people have to generate in this instance. Ruwain, are you joining in?
I'm allowing space, Andrew, for others to comment, but I mean, I am happy to talk about it. And, I like what Thandi says about it starts with us, right? And so, I mean, for me, this is continuous work. So, and I like, Andrew, the way you've put it to before is as we think about our mental models or situation, is to ask the question, what about this don't I understand, right? Because we often, we have a shortcut to understanding. And perhaps there are other ways of thinking about the same thing, right? And so that's, if I talk about mental models broadly, but just internalized oppression, right? I mean, this is true for all of us, right? In terms of it. So my understanding of internalized oppression is really based on social stigma and status of a social group that we assume that to be true about ourselves, right? And so and this is really understanding what is our understanding. So first of all, as we do the work internally, is understanding what is that stigma and how we internalize it, and how do we then transcend the stigma to create a positive sense of who we are instead of trying, keeping that negative sense of who we are. And that's difficult work to do on your own. And so, I mean, this is part of what I've also done as part of my own research around how do we use a concept like authenticity to create a positive sense of who we are as marginalized individuals in most of our professions and society.
One can even, one can even talk about that in the context of gender issues, because in gender issues, what lies behind it, there's a mental model called patriarchy, right? And what is that creating in women? It's creating a sense, not across the board. Please be clear that I'm not generalizing across the board. I'm simply saying that in society, it creates the sense in some women that they are lesser of. It's no wonder, things like the feminist traditions and so on began to resist that and say, no, there is no such thing, because there's no biological basis or some scientific basis why this is different. The fact that a man might be stronger than a woman is neither here nor there, because it's got nothing to do with whether you're now of a superior race than, say, women in this regard. So the whole thing about mental models can be transported, because you could say women could also be suffering, say, from internalized patriarchy. It's entirely possible, because some women could put themselves down in relation to, apart from the oppression that comes from patriarchy itself. And I think that's the point you're trying to make, the stigmas that we find ourselves in society, and that could be applied in any situation of oppression, basically. Regana Shay, thank you for joining in.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I think I'm sorry I joined a little bit late, but I think I wanted to maybe just cotton on to something that was said around the mental models. And I wondered how much of the mental models that we are proposing is influenced by our personal and social identity. In other words, how much of that do we on board, for example, and we carry that stuff with us, you know? So because the mental model is unconscious, you don't realize that it's sitting there.
Of course.
And then it kind of navigates your behavior all the way through, through different social settings and different work, you know, scenarios and that sort of thing. And I think the issue around it, and I think you're right, it doesn't actually matter what you start to sort of look at. It could be a race, gender, even ageism, for example. Some people are promoted, or they you know, they get into senior roles or leadership roles at a really young age, and they manage people that are different in terms of age groups to them, you know. So you've got that. And so, I mean, I just think about how much pressure that puts on an individual person, wherever they find themselves in their life, because they're almost swimming upstream in a way. They're contesting and contending with more than one mental model. It's not necessarily race. I think race is one of it. But there is a compounding sort of knock-on effect onto some of the other aspects that people tend to struggle with in an organization. I'm coming strictly from an organizational psychology perspective. And then this whole thing, and I think I like, it's almost at the cognitive dissonance that you end up having, you know, because I'm a female, I'm Muslim, I'm colored, you know, I'm young, I'm this and that. So you almost building up your identity around how you understand yourself. And then you're like, okay, maybe I shouldn't speak up so much because it would serve me better, you know, within the organizational system that I find myself, or in the network I find myself, to rather not speak up. And so then you kind of hold back on some things because the mental model plays out, or because you feel it in your body. And I don't know how much people pay attention to the way their body responds. It's like, I'm feeling this particular way, and you don't know what's driving that feeling a lot of the time. And so this whole thing about this inferiority complex starts to come forward. And I'm bringing in a lot of things here, but I think there's a lot that sort of interplays when you start speaking about what drives this. And it's very easy for our society to bring everything down to race. I'm very mindful of that. And I sort of wonder, is it always about race? I don't think so, because even within race, there's the ethnic issues and your genuine roots about where you come from and what you identify with and what you don't identify with. So it's remarkable how deep this actually goes for us as a society. And because we've got such big gaps, we're trying to play catch up, we're trying to mitigate the upstream issues, you know, as they come to the fore. But it's quite a provocative conversation. So I thank you. And thanks for allowing me to make a comment.
Thank you. Show us your face, Regana. Let's see, because
I will try. I don't know if you can see.
There you are. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just that we know who we're talking to. So I made the point earlier that the mental models is not a given. It's something that builds up because we come into society, we get socialized into it, we get conditioned into it. Some people would even say that by the age of 7, our belief system are more or less, the fundamentals of it are in place. And it's because of the socialization that took place with our parents, schools, the religious traditions that we believe in, and the communities that we grew up in, etc. All of these things begin to shape how do we think about things. I would want to say there's some theorists who would say, for example, and I know you say that there are many more issues when we talk about diversity, but I quoted somebody recently that said, race is not the elephant in the room, it is the room.
Mm.
A bit like fish inside water. Fish do not know that they are in water.
Mm.
It's a reality that they can only discover that once they step out of that reality, like say a fish falls on dry land, then a fish will realize, oh my goodness, yeah, where's my water? But at that point, a fish doesn't realize. So the question is that if you were to look at that and you were to look at all of the issues having happened around the world, you might wonder, it's not saying that we must get stuck in race. We have to resolve it. That's the issue. But we cannot resolve it if we are not able to talk authentically and openly about the issue, and recognizing, as this one commentator says, it is not the elephant in the room, it is the room. And are you willing to recognize that? Carry on, colleagues. Anybody? Tandy, jump in.
I think from experience from your last comment, Dr. Johnson, sometimes you recognize that it's not actually the elephant in the room, but the room itself. But then the context or contextual factors play such that you are even not able to raise what you are observing, what you are feeling, and yeah, it's difficult. I think for some of us, you probably want to play it first in your head to say, if I say it like this, how is it going to come out? If I do it like this, how is it going? By the time you realize you have not done anything about it and you wish it away.
So Tandy, absolutely. I think maybe perhaps Andrew has stepped. Are you there, Andrew?
I'm just talking from experience.
My apologies. I just wanted to switch on the light here because
how you want to raise it is something else, and sometimes you just decide, you know what, I'm just gonna walk away from it.
Yeah, sorry, I had to go and switch on the light. It was becoming dark. It started off in the light and so on. So I'm going to recognize, thanks for that input, Tandy. I'm going to take Stephen, Bakang, Andre, and Sylvia. Stephen, go for it.
Good evening, colleagues. Can you hear me, Andrew?
Yeah, no, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and some of the conversations I've been having with colleagues as we try and grapple with this in our environment is, and I think you've put a language to it around talking about the mental models, but we were just having conversations around saying, as a white person growing up in South Africa, if you look at your childhood, even I've got an 18-month-old, even my son's childhood, right? At what points and in what contexts will a white child or a white person in general, but I think the importance of childhood really is quite, as you mentioned earlier, an important part here. But at what context do white kids interact with people who are not white, right? And we found ourselves having this conversation going, we're trying to have diversity inclusion workshops and we're trying to really grapple with this. And as we think about it, we're trying to undo generations and even for an individual, years of wiring around how they interact with Black people, right? And if I think about it, I think as a white child growing up in South Africa, how often are your interactions with people of color? What is the most often context? It's most often in service to you, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's a shop, whether it's your nanny, whether it's someone who's cleaning a restaurant, and your experience of Black people primarily is in service to you.
Mm, mm.
And we've had the conversation around how do you undo that? Because I think for a lot of white people, unless, what we've done through colonialism, apartheid, and post-apartheid, if we're honest, right, is we've created these societies within a society, right? And it's funny because in a lot of Western countries, they talk about diversity and inclusion, in terms of minorities, right? As white people, we're a minority, but it's very infrequent in my life where I'm the only white person in the room in my entire life, right? I have to actively go and seek that out. And I found that, and I suppose in the spirit of discovery, I haven't figured it out yet, to be honest. And going in, how do we overcome that subconscious rewiring that your entire life growing up, your primary interaction with people of color is that they serve me as a white person. And that's just something that I've been grappling with, and maybe a theory that I have around one of the reasons why when you're around, when you ask people, anonymously, their views and what they might think when no one else is there, or when it's only white people around the bride, for example, it's quite scary,
Of course.
and quite shameful even for myself. You look at yourself and go, man, like flip. I thought I was along the journey here, and you have to catch yourself.
And how easily we slip in that time.
Yeah.
So two comments on what you say. Thanks, Stephen, for that input. Obviously, I think for many of us who grew up in the apartheid days, and that's all we knew. I finished all my schooling, even tertiary schooling, in that environment, most of it. And but I think it is shifting because a lot of the younger people are now stepping into environments that are much more diverse. We weren't in diverse, it was very separated and segregated and so on. So I think there's a chance with the younger people that it could potentially begin to shift. And I think if I look at how my kids, for example, interact with kids across the board, it's very different to what I can remember as a young person myself, which means something is happening there. The second thing I want to say, again, not providing final answers, is really to say that one of the ways of dealing with mental models is to bring it into our conscious attention. Why is that important? It's because mental models operate at an unconscious level, which means you're going to see and react already on the basis of what is already there, because it's already been automated to a level of unconsciousness in your mind. So your response is just going to be default and automatic. So one way of dealing with mental models is that we have to bring it into our conscious mind. How can we do that? By labeling what is the mental model. So if I were to label it and say, this thing that I've been struggling with as a Black person, oh, it is Black internalized racism. I knew something about it and I could even give examples, but now I've got a label, not in a way of putting everything and anything into it, but simply to help you keep it in your conscious mind to say, oh, if I act like this, I potentially act within a particular mental model. So my advice is that one way of dealing with mental models by their very nature unconscious is to bring it into your conscious mind. How? Label it. Okay? Baka, Go for it.
Good evening.
Let's see your face.
I'm trying to fix it just now. Just please give me a moment. One of the aspects that I was gonna speak about, you touched on it as a young person. But in your presentation, you mentioned something about what we see actually shape our behavior or shape how we act, right? So in my learning of being a psychologist, I realized that it's not just about the exposure. It's actually also about nature versus nature, how we grew up, how we've been raised, end up contributing to how we can actually, set out to the world, how we're going to present ourselves to the world, and how we see the next person who is different in terms of our ethnicity. So when you mention something about young people actually are the ones who trying to be in a more diverse areas, and me being one of them, actually I realized that you end up learning not just about your own race, but the other cultures also.
Absolutely.
And end up, the conditioned mind that you have end up being, being washed off, like actually this is actually true, and this actually all along has been a myth the entire time. So you get to understand and learn. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for that contribution, Batan.
Thank you.
And Ruwain often reminds me, maybe it's the young people where our hope lies that it can be significantly different in the future. So thank you for your contribution. Andre, please go for it. Welcome.
Evening, Andrew. Yeah, I've been listening to the discussions and I'm fascinated with the various inputs. I want to go back right to your introduction where you spoke about the mental models and the fact that they are a lot of times unconscious. So here's the train of thought. So if the mental model is unconscious, it leads to behavior without intent. If there is no intent, there is no guilt, and if there's no guilt, there's no shame. So that leaves me with two questions. A, are we not, also in that sense, are we not letting white people off the hook too easily? And B, if there is no intent, so in other words, is that not the consequence of sometimes what we see around the consequences of racism and alleged racism? Should we then not be perhaps softer with one another in terms of the direct aftermath of experience, an instance of racism or oppression? So just two thoughts that I had. Thanks.
Sure. We should be softer with each other, but I'm hoping that we are softer with each other in an authentic way. In other words, I can have a frank conversation with you, but it's not in order to destroy you. It's to say, let's talk honestly and openly about it. So, there are different ways in terms of doing it. Let me just say to you that one of the ideas that we have, remember I spoke earlier about design causality. We're saying from an action science point of view that we actually design our own actions in our heads. Even when that particular intent is unconscious, we own accountability with regard to that intention. Because what we do next in the way we act, that's the way that we would see it, is entirely based on that particular action. Now, a person might say, well, I unconsciously operated like that. But then in a conversation, for example, it might be necessary then to lift out what is exactly lying behind the way that you behave. Because I think often human beings in general, and this is what mental models also do, mental models would say, you, Andre, are accountable, but not me. In other words, I don't give the same it's almost like applying asymmetrical standards, whereby I don't want to take accountability for my actions, but I ascribe accountability to you because it's not me, it's an external thing. It's this external attribution of cause. We're saying when you begin to examine what is going on in your own head, it puts you in a better position to be able to take responsibility for what you will then see and act on afterwards, because you can't say no. Some people might say, well, the devil made me do it. No, that's not sufficient. It's almost like saying, no, I have no accountability. But there is accountability, the very fact that we design our own actions to achieve consequences that we intended. That would be my view, Andre. Thanks very much, Andre. Sylvia?
Hi, Dr. Andrew. Hi, everyone. Let's see if the video is going to work. Yes, yeah. So for me, the biggest thing is that everything that we do, each and every one of us has to take the responsibility, for their own decisions and then how to change the situation. Because where I'm sitting, I'm looking at us, we're changing things for the next generation. We have gone through these issues, you in the organization and you're doing the best that you can, but there's still issues, just because of your race, your gender, your age, all those things, they are playing out. So what are we going to do to ensure that the next generation doesn't go through the same changes, the same challenges that we went through? So they say the things that you overcome yourself, you're actually putting the next generation to start at a better level. So for me, I challenge us as individuals to say, we may not have caused it, but we are finding ourselves in the organizations, we're finding ourselves, and we can even see it at times when people are mistreated, in front of us, but, we just choose to turn a blind eye. So these kind of discussions are challenging us as individuals to say, you as a person, what can you do? Because we tend to look at other people and say, yeah, this group must do something, this other group must do something. But if we as individuals, I decide that me as Sylvia, I'll call it out when I see it, I will address it when I need to address it, then I start making a difference for people around me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. And I think it is this issue about us wanting to take responsibility for our actions and not, just leave it to some kind of arbitrary force that maybe made us do things. Then we can begin to move forward perhaps a bit more effectively. Elmine, your hand was up. Please go for it.
Yes, thank you. So I'm always wondering, what is the role of the narrative in, forming these values and beliefs that we have? Because it's also what we hear from, like Bachman said, nature versus nurture. It's a narrative that plays a role. And I think the narrative is very important for all of us also to realize. You talk about we take responsibility going forward for this whole diversity and inclusion matter. And then it's really that sensitization about the narrative, because sometimes I think we are in a new dispensation, but keeping on referring to an old dispensation and just reinforcing old beliefs. And it's like looking over your shoulder all the time and hoping that you won't bump into something, that will be a barrier. So as long as you keep on looking over your shoulder, chances are that you are going to bump into barriers that will prevent you from performing optimally.
Sure. Do you think it's possible that we keep on bumping into exactly a question, that we keep on bumping into exactly the same issue precisely because we have not laid to rest properly the issue at hand? Or do we even know exactly what is the issue? And I stated this question, do we know exactly what is the question we are trying to resolve here? And therefore, it keeps on coming back with unresolved issues. And I would want to take a view that it appears that we find ourselves in a very deep, unresolved space currently in our country. Would it be your view?
It's an interesting question, because what actually raised this whole narrative with me was a young person that said to me, I mean, I went through a whole schooling system that is free and integrated, and yet so many of us have these issues. And where does it come from? And the person said to me, it's because of the narrative. So if you think about it, if a person is actually, let's say with a new dispensation, everyone said, now I zip my lip, I'm never going to talk about the old. What would be the mindset of the young people that grew through a system that's more integrated and more free and more fair, for that matter? So it's really just asking the question, do we also think about the narrative and what we talk, what we speak to each other, and how it may reinforce this whole thing that is the elephant in the room or just the room.
Yeah. Show us your face, Elmine.
Yes, certainly I will do that. Here I am.
Yes, Elmine, thank you very much. We want to know our colleagues, because sometimes you hear a name, but you don't know who's the face behind it. Thank you very much for that input.
Thank you.
I think it is pointing to the fact of much more conversation. It is trying to understand some of these things and trying to make sense of the issues as we go along. It does appear to me, and maybe others can comment on it, but it does appear to me that precisely because we haven't fully laid to rest the issues in a way of conversing about it, where we can say, no, now I'm comfortable, let me move on. It would be okay, you know, but maybe we're not quite there yet. Marina, please go for it.
Good evening, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. So I've sat here the whole hour and I was wondering whether I'm going to have the guts to open my camera and speak.
Thank you for having the guts. Thank you very much.
But I thought I can't leave without, you know, adding, because that's why I signed up. I wanted to join the conversation around this, and I fully agreed with Tandi's first input when she said it needs to start with us as individuals. And my contribution and is actually a request to everyone on the call, and especially maybe to you as the facilitators in the sessions. Many of us work as individuals, and we don't work in organizations. We work for organizations, and we are the psychologists who come with the solutions. But we very rarely find ourselves in our own organization where we can have those authentic conversations that exposes the mental models. And that is personally what I hope to get from these conversations among my people, if I can put it like that, my fellow colleagues who have the theoretical knowledge and who have the academic basis and foundations from where we work. But I really hope to find a space where we can engage in the conversation and learn from each other. Personally, I feel very clumsy in being here, and but I have lots of years of being a white person in South Africa, and I want to join in the conversation and have my own mental models exposed, so that, like you said, we can look at it and change it and allow it to change our actions and behaviors that then have an impact on the relationships that we have with each other, and from where we build. So from my side, just a thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Marina. And I appreciate that, that you have the courage to say that, because I think eventually we should feel this comfort to be able to talk to each other. And you know, the point that Tandi made about it being in the individual space, mental models need to be dealt with there first. You have to deal with your mental model. You can't you know what happens in organizations. I was just giving a lecture to my students at UJ the other day, and what happens is that mental models in organization collectively become what we call organizational defensive routines. So all the individuals with their mental models and their defensiveness stepping up into that space create this broader organizational culture that becomes very defensive. But it's precisely why tackling them has to be very much at an individual level also. But we work with others because we learn in the process with others. How can we do it better, obviously, to go along, but it is very much an individual project in the first instance, but it can also be a collective project, like, for example, in an organization. Thanks very much, Marina. Ruwain, your hand was up.
And I think it fits into, thanks, Andrew, for the opportunity. I think it fit, this is clumsy. So if the words don't come out the way it should come out, I'm okay with it, because the idea around this is for us to say it the way we think and not in an elegant way like Andrew does. So for me, that's part of the conversation, Andrew, right? So I think for me, Elmine, when you were talking about narrative is so important. And Andrew, as I was thinking about narrative is almost the script, the mental model, right? And I think narrative is also what forms who we are. And if the narrative is incorrect, how we are formed them is incorrect as well, right? And so it's important to get the narrative right. And so we operate within the context of others. So it's the me versus the we within the broader context, right? So there's always this tension between my sense of uniqueness to that social category, whether those social categories are race, ethnicity, gender, whatever that may be. And so we always have this kind of tension. The more we unique, the more we are isolated. The more we integrate, the more we just become like sheep. And so what is that unique set? How do we, what tension do we create in terms of forming who we are, and not just following the narrative or just not following the script, but creating our own sense of who we are, right? And so that for me is important. And that work, as we said, starts with ourselves and understanding who we are and what our stories are, because those stories are what form who we are, right? And I think that for me, so that triggered that narrative thing. And I think if the narrative and the script is incorrect, or not accurate, we are basing ourselves on an accurate way of who we are. And that's where the stereotypical, the kind of marginalization and all of those kind of things that have through generations have evolved, where people base who they are on incorrect scripts or incorrect narratives. And I think that's in narrative, I think is important, and we need to get the narratives right.
And one of the key things that we will, in fact, later pick up in one of our clumsy conversations is exactly the very fundamental building blocks of narrative, and that's language. So we have to look at how language forms this kind of narrative, that we begin to subscribe to, rather this than another. And it's going to be one of our clumsy conversations we will have later on, but very important point, that narrative in the context of what we're talking about. Thank you very much. I know some people are dropping off and we are over time, so we will conclude in the next 5 minutes. So thank you for those who have been here and are dropping off. I understand that you have other responsibilities, but we will conclude in 5 minutes time if there are any other comments by any from the floor. Any other comments, colleagues, or inputs or comments?
Just one last comment from myself,
Sure.
Andrew. As I'm listening to colleagues, I'm just also reflecting on the reality of when we speak about also the narrative on a larger scale, be it in organizations where issues of, for instance, subsistence issues, where issues of racism, issues of pay inequities, issues of discrimination still exist. Vis-a-vis even the broader country where we still deal with, not long ago, we were hearing on the news about a racial issue at Stellenbosch universities. I'm just trying to sort of reflect and saying to myself, okay, fine, I know we're talking about the narrative, but in the end, who writes that narrative? Who drives that narrative? And to what extent am I as a person, again, myself, starting with myself, vis-a-vis the bigger picture of some of the narratives that still form very much realities of the world we live in right now, and the South Africa that we still find ourselves very much in right now. Yeah. But perhaps it's something maybe for the next conversation, but yeah.
But you know, if you were to think about, I mean, your question is who writes the narrative? I think in a broad sense, one can say comfortably, the most dominant force in that particular context will write the narrative. There's no doubt about it. So for example, if you are in an organization, management is the most dominant force within the organization, and they will kind of write the narrative that is applicable in that context. Not to say people don't make inputs to it. So it's about looking at what is the most dominant force in that particular context, and then you might get some insight as to, oh, so this is where the narrative comes from. Nowadays, one of the big forces in our broader geopolitical sense are big corporations. Are they beginning to write the narrative of what's happening broader in the world? Are we aware that these corporations are becoming bigger than, for example, some countries? Their GDP is much bigger than some countries in the world. So who decides then the narrative that is going to be applicable in that context? I just want to make another point because you raised it on as an interesting one. It was quite interesting the other day when I read a report about the incident at Stellenbosch. A journalist asked, and this came from a white journalist, which was even more interesting. The journalist asked, is the problem that particular person who exhibited racist behavior in that context, or is the problem the system in Stellenbosch that allows that to happen? And it's not my comment, colleagues, so don't think it's me now making critique. This was interesting because it came from a white journalist asking such a question, which again brings us to this issue of, are we talking, when we talk, for example, of something like racism, is racism an issue around some bad apples in the barrel, or is it the barrel? That is kind of the question that one has to grapple with in terms of really trying to find how do you deal with these issues a little bit differently and perhaps more effectively than what we have before. So colleagues, we are on our time now, unless somebody puts up a quick hand. I don't know what happened in the chat box. Let me just see.
Andrew, people are mainly saying goodbye.
Carry on.
I said people are mainly saying goodbye or thank you. So there's no real conversation in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
I've been following it.
So thanks very much, colleagues, for that. You know, even if you didn't specifically verbally participate, your very presence here was an important one. We appreciate that, and thank you very much for coming in. As I said, it's not settling the issue. It's almost saying, well, let's talk some more about it, because there are a few things that maybe stood out. Let me go and reflect about it. Let's think some more. And that is the intent of the webinars in general, and what we were trying to achieve here this evening, to be aware of mental models, how they impact, not when we just talk about diversity or race issues, but mental models affect our life in general. And we all have to keep on examining what are these mental models that drive how we think about things and then act. And certainly when we talk about this diversity issue and the transformation agenda in SIOPSA, we're trying to say, let's put it on the surface, let's label it, and let's talk about it so that we can begin to get better insights. How can we deal with it better as we step forward? Let me just say to all of you colleagues, thank you very much. And for you who have stayed over a little bit, appreciate your time here. We will indicate when is the next one. Please come. We want to have many more conversations. And sometimes it may even mean we come back and we revisit something. But thank you very much for your time this evening. And I hope you all have a lovely evening further. Thanks very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you,
Andrew.
Dr. Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruben.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.